Hey everyone, welcome back to another rollicking episode of Zilog and Moto, the show where we dig deep into the 8 and 16-bit history of Sega, and not only showcase games you're familiar with, but also the ones you may not know exist. Literally, if I can comprehend what's going on the screen, it's on the table to be discussed. In today's episode, we're focusing on the 8-bit side of things, going back to April of 1989, and taking a look at a title that was only released in the United States and Europe, at least until a later Game Gear port brought the game to the Far East. And that title is the Master System port of Rastan by Taito. In the 80s, action movies were king, and the subgenre of barbarian-styled action films like Conan, Red Sonja, and The Beastmaster had done incredibly well. And as I've mentioned before, the stories in action movies are generally ripe for production into video games. But sometimes it's easier just to create your own archetype characters and build a game around them. Enter Rastan. Rastan was originally released in the arcades in 1987 by Taito, running on hardware that was actually pretty similar to what the Mega Drive would release with a year later, utilizing a Motorola 68000 and a Zilog Z80 clocked just slightly faster than the Mega Drive, and 3 sound processors, one of which was a Yamaha YM2151, which is a precursor of the YM2612 that was used in the Mega Drive. Rastan proved to be a hit in the arcades, and as a result was ported to the usual 8-bit European computers like the Commodore 64, the Amstrad CPC, and the ZX Spectrum, along with ports to DOS and Apple IIgs. But it never officially appeared on 16-bit computers like the Amiga, Atari ST, or Macintosh. Interestingly, the port of the game to the MSX was its only appearance in Japan until the previously mentioned Game Gear version. The Master System port, which we're looking at today, appears to have been first released in PAL regions in 1988, and then in April of 1989 in the United States. I say appears to because there's some conflicting information out there about its release, which is always a problem when you're talking about things that happened 30 years ago, before we could all log all this silly information on wikis on the internet. Regardless of where it landed first, Rastan released in the middle of a bit of a technical no man's land, with the port arriving in the US well after the Mega Drive debuted in Japan, but before it was available in Europe or the US, where the Sega platform available was the Master System. Taito essentially had a choice. Do we wait until the Genesis is available, or do we work on and release a port now while the game has neg recognition from the arcades? And they went with the latter, resulting in an attempt to shove a game originally designed to run on 16-bit hardware into an 8-bit space. It's certainly not the only time this has been done, and we've already looked at several games that had similar production, most recently with Dynamite Ducks in episode 66. When this sort of thing happens, questions always abound. Just what are they going to have to cut to make it fit? Is it going to have all the same levels featured in the arcade? Or, if it was originally a 2-player title, is this version going to be 2 players as well? Or only 1? Sometimes developers are able to pull off magic with these types of downgrades, and produce titles that still accurately reflect the original source material. And then other times, let's just say they take the easy way out and make a game that really resembles the original title in name only. Which category does Rastan fall into? And should you be on the lookout to add it to your Master System collection? Well, we'll take a look at all that, but first, a look at the package. And here is Rastan for the Master System, and this is specifically the American version. You can't really tell from the outside because the cover art is the same on both the American and European versions, but you'll definitely be able to tell once we open it up and look at the manual, which is in the American portrait format versus the PAL landscape format to accommodate the other languages. The cover art itself isn't the best thing I've ever seen, but compared to earlier Master System titles, it's fantastic. As you can see, Rastan is fighting off some of the enemies you'll see in the game, notably a Gardas, the green creature with 2 arms, and then some mace things, and yes, that's their real name, coming up in the background, and some Kemlers, Rastan's version of a Chimera, waiting in the corner to attack. I think I would have rather liked to see Rastan looking up versus down at the Gardas, but that's an incredibly minor complaint. However, I do very much like how the name is presented with the official Rastan logo at the top, rather than just black text, it looks very sharp, and definitely more appealing when sitting on a shelf. This is a cover I could see a kid drawn to in 1989. Also, just as a note, you may have noticed that the game is titled Rastan and not Rastan Saga, as it was originally called in Japan. I'm not really sure why they made that change, but apparently there was more story in the Japanese version that didn't get translated to the United States, and the decision was made to drop the saga part of the title due to it not really being much of a saga without that backstory. This copy of Rastan is in really good shape. The outer cover doesn't have any defects that I can tell, no scratches or blemishes on the cover, with the only thing being that the hang tab has been removed. But at least whoever cut it off made a nice even removal, so you can barely tell it was there. The inner cover looks great as well, with no sun bleaching, water damage, or other wear. On the spine it uses the Rastan logo as well, so this one will definitely stand out in your Master System library. Moving on to the back, there's 4 decent quality screenshots from the game, each featuring a scene from a different level. They could have been a bit larger, especially since the sprites in the game are on the small side, which we'll get to later, but I've certainly seen worse. Also, we've got yellow outlined boxes with the information about the game, and it does feature 7 worlds, so to speak, with each one featuring 3 levels. The flavor text is pretty good as well. I could totally envision this being the script to a commercial, and having the announcer reading some of this like, "But beware, the king has sent over 100 men into Simia, and each one has met his doom. Will you?" Opening the box up, and the cartridge and manual are in great shape. Whoever had owned this before definitely did a good job of taking care of it. This is the US version, so it has the US manual, and it's in standard Master System format of all blue print. As far as Master System manuals go, this is a really good one. I don't know if that's because Taito put some extra effort into it or what, but just from the outside you can tell it's a little thicker than the usual Master System manual. As you open it up, just look at all these screenshots and pictures. I'm not sure I've ever seen this many graphics in one of these manuals. It's literally just page after page of items, screenshots of hazards, and some badass drawings of the enemies. If you were to know nothing about the game and just read this manual, you'd think it was pretty damn cool. And that's definitely not something all manuals get across, as some barely tell you how to play the game, much less anything else. Okay, well that's the package. Let's tackle this game and see if it lives up to this pretty nice packaging. As I mentioned before, Rastan is based on an arcade game from 1987 that was running on hardware that was more or less a Genesis/Mega Drive, so significantly more powerful than a Master System. However, 1987 is still relatively early as far as 16-bit games are concerned. To compare it to the System 16, only 3 games were released before 1987. Why am I saying this? Well, because even though Rastan was a game running on 16-bit hardware, it certainly wasn't a game that was pushing that hardware very hard. Now, don't get me wrong, for an arcade title in 1987, it looked pretty decent, and ran extremely smoothly, but all the characters were relatively small and the backgrounds weren't overly detailed, with no parallax scrolling or other special effects. And again, I'm not trying to slam the game, I'm just trying to point out that 16-bit games would get much more impressive as the years went on, in the arcades and at home. Because of that, I understand Taito's choice to go ahead and develop the title for the Master System rather than waiting on the Mega Drive, because theoretically, due to the relative simplicity of the arcade version, a port to an 8-bit console shouldn't have to give up too much in terms of details in order to replicate the game. Shouldn't have. Unfortunately, I'm not sure what happened in the porting of this title to the Master System, if it was rushed or handed off to Taito programmers that didn't have much experience with working on the console, or if there was just too much content to try to cram into a 2 megabit cartridge. But what we have here is a game that only resembles the arcade version in passing. And I think the most frustrating part of it is that I know the Master System is capable of better, because I've seen it. A Master System title not being a picture-perfect port of a 16-bit arcade release isn't surprising, and I don't want to dwell too much on that, so let's move on to the game itself, and try to analyze the game from the mindset of being a kid in 1989, being able to play the game on a TV in his living room or bedroom. Just like the arcade title, Rastan is a side-scrolling action title where you play the titular barbarian hero, Rastan, as he has been given the quest to rescue the king's daughter, who was kidnapped and taken away to the wild land of Semia. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? And it is, with your job to control Rastan as he moves across 7 specific areas in Semia, seeking out a castle in that area, and then fighting a boss in that castle. Not unlike a certain Italian plumber. I make that Mario reference for a bit of levity, but also due to the fact that while I think the action genre fits Rastan best, it also features a strong element of platforming. This isn't Golden Axe where you might have to jump occasionally to avoid pits. In Rastan, you definitely have to get a firm handle on what types of jumps you use and the timing and distance on said jumps, or else you're going to be in for a bad time. This is a problem because Rastan definitely does not have the best controls, or at least I should say the jumping in the game is awkward at best, because attacks usually work pretty well by either pressing the attack button to attack in the direction you're facing, or by pressing up or down and then attack to strike up or down. Specifically, that downward strike is going to save your ass, especially against bosses, so learn how to do that early and often. Rastan jumps like, I don't know, Spider-Man right after he got his powers and hadn't figured out how to control them yet. Specifically, you can do a small jump left or right by pressing left or right in the jump button, but then you can also do a larger jump left, right, or straight up by pressing up left, up right, or just up and jump. This sort of works, but the problem is most of the time the small jumps won't let you get to where you need to go, which means you have to rely on the large jumps, which wouldn't be that big a deal except for the fact that once you jump, you have no control over where you go. So if you jump a little too far, well, good luck, as you're probably going to miss your landing and end up in a pit beside it and take damage. The pits will be deep enough to where you have to try the large jump to get back out, which jumps you just far enough to miss the platform again and land in the pit on the other side. There's a sequence like this in the first level of the 6th area that also adds in sliding angled platforms to the mix, and a block that you have to destroy by attacking at the end to keep going, and it's an absolute nightmare. The rest of the platforming in the game I like for the most part. As long as you're patient in certain sections, you'll do fine. The swinging on the vines reminds me of Pitfall or Jungle Hunt, and according to the website giantbomb.com, Rastan was an innovator with its wall jumping implementation to reach higher ledges. So it's not all bad, but there's definitely certain sections where you will be pulling your hair out. Softening the blow of the sometimes poor jumping mechanics is how Rastan deals with damage. Rastan has a life bar that allows you to take a certain amount of damage before you die. This damage can come from many sources, either coming into contact with enemies or their projectiles, spikes, spears, and other environmental dangers, or the previously mentioned pits filled with water or lava. Because of all the combat with enemies and the lack of an extra life concept that we'll get to in a minute, Taito was fairly generous with the life bar, so while falling into a pit should definitely be avoided, it's not the end of the world like it is in other games, which is nice. Now, I just mentioned that Rastan lacks an extra life concept. That might sound a little confusing at first, but what I mean by that is quite simple. You only get one life in Rastan. Yep, just one. And the only time your life bar is refilled, other than collecting potions and ram's heads, is when you defeat a boss. However, you are provided with 3 continues, and the continues restart you in the section where you died, so there's no having to go back and start over an area from the beginning business. If you made it to a boss section, you go right back to the boss section. As you can imagine, with the way the game is structured, even with 3 continues, it's a bit difficult to make it through the game the entire way, and I openly admit, when I tried to play the game honestly, I think I was able to make it to about the 4th or 5th area before game over. Thankfully, like we've seen with a lot of other Master System titles, Taito saw fit to include a simple cheat code that allows infinite continues. Purists may scoff, but I certainly appreciate the built-in ability to have the choice of how many continues I have, for those times when I'm limited on time and I just want to do some hacking and slashing without having to memorize jump timings or when to avoid certain areas because they have nearly invisible spikes that pop out. I've focused a lot so far on the platforming mechanics, or lack thereof in the game, but what about the combat? You are the fierce barbarian Rastan, after all, are you not? Rastan starts out the game with his trusty sword, and it's a pretty good weapon, decent reach, and it dispatches many enemies in just one hit, which usually gives a nice blood splatter, something that you didn't really see at all in 1989. Rastan might not be the first game to feature blood, but it's certainly the earliest one I can think of. You can also gain a battle axe, mace, or fire sword that not only does normal swing damage, but also shoots out fireballs. Combat feels good for the most part. However, enemies have a tendency to respawn, and the levels have an interesting feature where time passes as you make your way through the level. And if you take too long, it will get dark and the enemies will appear tougher, giving you added incentive to try to make your way through quicker. Fighting the bosses comes down to learning patterns, as is the case with most action games, but that time element is present there as well, as during the boss levels, you will slowly lose health as time passes, even if you're able to avoid the boss's attacks. I think overall the combat elements in Rastan are probably the best part of the game, and certainly where I had the most fun, minus the bats, which somehow have been the bane of my existence 2 games in a row. If I ever come up with a top 10 rules of 8 and 16-bit games, rule number 3 is probably going to be, if it has bats in it, there's a good chance it's a pain in the ass. I mentioned a bit earlier in discussing the port from the arcades aspect of the game that it came up short in a lot of areas, but one place that it didn't was all the enemies and items that were included. I can't say for certain if all of the items and enemies made the cut, but certainly a lot of them did. Each level has a wide mix of enemies to fight, and you're not limited to just the same 3 enemies over and over again, with possibly getting more in the next area. Also, all 7 of the bosses in the game are quite different, and things really kick up a notch with the last 2 as far as variety is concerned. There's no concerns about fighting a just slightly harder version of a boss that you've already faced. To fight that vast assortment of enemies, not only can you obtain the 3 additional weapons I mentioned before, you can get different pieces of armor, potions to regain health, and poisons to reduce it if you're not careful, items that clear the screen of enemies, and jewels to pump up your score. There's a lot going on here, and every game is going to be different as non-weapon items appear randomly when you defeat enemies. So, at least in regards to content, Taito did a solid job on the port. However, where Taito failed in its effort to bring the game to the Master System is in regards to the critical areas of graphics and sound. I mentioned earlier that some of this could be due to trying to cram the game into a 2MB cartridge, especially in regards to the sound. Like casino games, the game strangely features a separate soundtrack for use with the FM module of the Mark III, even though it wasn't released in Japan, so that space was essentially wasted. To be fair, I do prefer the FM version, not because of the background music, but because the sound effects are clearly improved. The soundtrack that most people will hear when playing the game is mediocre and repetitive, with more or less only 3 tracks the entire game. The graphics are poor as well. As I said, I don't expect a full 16-bit arcade experience on an 8-bit console, but what you get here is pretty poor, with probably the second area in the jungle being the worst of the worst. All the sprites are low detail, and there's a standard Master System flicker when you get too many things on the same line. And the color palette's pretty limited as well. I'm going to say probably the worst thing I can say about a 1989 Master System title, and that is, well, it looks like an NES game. Yeah, I said it. Sometimes with these reviews, I know pretty quickly how I'm going to rate the game, and using a 5-point scale makes that a little bit easier as there's only so many choices for ratings to give it. However, I know that Rastan is a favorite of some people online, most notably a certain Pat the NES Punk. So, after finishing the game yesterday and recording the game footage, I decided I'd sleep on it and really try to be fair to the game. However, even with that extra reflection time, I just can't give it higher than 2 stars. If it had come out in 1987, that'd be one thing, but the world was different by 1989 with the dawn of the 16-bit era, and 8-bit titles really needed to step up their game to compete.
That was just not the case here, and while there's far worse Master System titles, I think this is a game where only major action and arcade fans really need to apply.
And that was Rastan. It's not a bad game, but man, it's hard to play and not think of wasted potential. It really seems like this was a very quick and dirty Taito production. Just get a few programmers and artists into a room and bang it out. There's certainly a lot of worse games out there, but I think if you really want to play Rastan, seek out the arcade version and a copy of MAME. It's infinitely better, and I think you'll have a lot more fun, unless you just really, really, really like playing games on the Master System. Tune in next week as we go back to the Genesis and play a game that I didn't decide on until last night, when it kind of hit me like a cartoon character who all of a sudden has a light bulb turn on over their head. Believe it or not, I don't always have these planned out weeks ahead of time. I know, right? I seem so organized. Anyway, it's a game I've mentioned before on the channel, specifically due to its inclusion in the arcades in Yakuza 0. Yep, it's time to have that magical sound shower wash all over me. That sounded bad. Just come back next week for Outrun. My sunburn will be gone, and it'll be less awkward than this closing section. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.